Today we'll be going over the assembly of a DR3 or 4. So here we have a DR3, so it's got the 3 output wheels. The assembly is the same for the DR3 and the DR4. The only exception being there are a couple extra more parts, but the assembly is pretty much identical. Here it's a DR3-24-4. Here's what's included in your DR3 or DR4. Here we're going to have your 1/2" hex bearings. Here it's 7 because we're doing a DR3, but for a DR4 it would be 9. Here's your output pulleys. Here it's 3, 4 for DR4. Our input pulley, our 1/2" hex spacers. Here it's 10. On a DR3 it would be 12, and then a 1/4" spacer. Here's your 4 gearbox bolts. They're 3/8 inch longs, 1/4 20. Here you're going to have your shaft hardware, so it's 6 or 8 washers and 6 or 8 1/2" long 1/4 20 screws, as well as your output shafts. And you're either going to have 3 for a DR3 or 4 for a DR4. They're also going to include the correct belts you need. So here we're going to have, for DR3, you have 2 drive belts that take power from the drive pulley and split it down to the two outputs, and then a link belt. For the DR4, you're just going to have 1 extra link belt. Before we start assembly, we want to make sure that we have the location of our gearbox picked out. You'll notice that the drive rail is different on one side compared to the other. This is the side the gearbox will bolt to. However, if you want the gearbox outboard of the robot, you can just turn it like this. But it is important to understand, to know where the gearbox is going to be before that we assemble it. You can assemble the drive rails without the gearbox being attached first. You can add it afterwards, but you do need to know where or which input the gearbox is going to be using to run the belts correctly during assembly. The only tool you're going to need is a 5/32 hex key, just any standard hex key. It does make it easier if you use T-handles or other power tools, just to make assembly a little bit faster, but it still goes pretty fast with just a regular hex key. Now that you've decided where you want your gearbox to be mounted, you have your pre-assembled gearbox without motors, so it's a little bit lighter, a little bit easier to move around. Today we're going to be mounting it in an outboard configuration, motors facing in. It's fairly simple. So the first thing we're going to do, clear a little bit of space, is we're going to be attaching it here. So if you notice, the bearings on these gearboxes stick out just a little bit, and it allows it to line up with the drive rail, so you can't have any misalignment there. So the first thing we're going to do is attach this gearbox, and to do that, we're going to use our shorter 1/4 20s. They're 3/8 long, so you can thread them in, make sure that bearing is aligned, and start to thread the screws in. If you notice on the front of this, it has plenty of clearance that you can just reach right through the rail and thread right into the gearbox without there being any issues. Plenty on the lower ones, and on the top ones, there are clearance holes for the head of the bolt that just thread right in. Once you get them all installed, you can go ahead and snug them down. All right, so now that we have our gearbox location selected, now we're going to add our belts to the system. So now that we have our gearbox attached, we're going to start doing the belt system. So because we decided to have our gearbox here, that's where the input pulley is going to go, our output pulleys, and our belt system is going to look something like this, where we have our 2 drive belts and then our link belt surrounding these 2. in a second you'll see that you need to make sure the belts are alternating when we insert these into the tube. So the first one we're going to insert into the tube. It's one of the output pulleys with one of the drive belts. Right now it doesn't matter what side it's on. We'll just insert that into the end of the tube. So the next one is going to be the input pulley. And when we're doing this, we'll then add our second drive pulley to the end. And then insert that into the end of the tube as well. So if you notice, the belts are just wide enough and the pulleys are too wide for the belt to slip past the pulley, so that even though this pulley is down inside of here, it will just follow along with the belt as it gets pushed down the tube. So now another output pulley, and here's where it's important to make sure that we are alternating the belts so that they fit correctly and they don't get crossed up inside the tube. So here we go, here's our link belt. Now we can start, let gravity do the work, but just make sure that they get pulled down and not caught up on anything. All right, and then we can insert our last around that belt. So now we can start pulling down everything, getting everything into position. There we go. All right, that's close enough. So the next part that we have to do is actually insert one side of the shaft into that. So we're going to start setting up our output shafts. So the first thing we're going to do is obviously we're going to add our washers to all of our screws. This is what holds the output shafts into it, so it is quite important. All right, now we have that done. We can take each output shaft and just thread a screw into each end. These are the 1/4 20 by 1/2 inch long screws. They don't need to be tight, they just need to be threaded in enough that they're not going to fall out. All right, now we take one of the 1/2 inch hex bearings and install it onto each shaft so that it is flange side out. And we just do that for all three. And the next step is a washer on each shaft. Just a single spacer, 1/16 inch spacer on each shaft. All right, so now we have this done. What we can do is line up one of these belt systems and insert a pulley into each side. Notice that on the back, I'm actually not putting the bearing in the hole. I'm leaving it loose just so that it's easier to line everything up right now. So we'll do the next one. Find the pulley, insert the shaft. On this input shaft, the first thing we actually need to do is push this all the way through. We're going to take off the screw that we installed when we assembled the gearbox. And we're going to add our 1/4 inch spacer. So now we can let that fall out a little bit, and then we can move the pulley, the input pulley, into place above that spacer. Because all the bearings, none of the bearings are in the proper locations right now, none of the belts will be tight, so this should be fairly easy to move into place. Spin it to get it lined up and pop it through. And then we can get this last one to go into position. So the first one we recommend doing is the input. So we'll take that screw and washer we just took off of there, get it ready. We'll insert a 1/16 inch spacer and a 1/2 inch hex bearing. And then screw that into the end of the input shaft there on the gearbox. All right, so before we do anything else, we'll flip this over. And now what we'll do is insert another 1/16 inch spacer on this side of each output shaft, the side that does not have a bearing on it or a spacer yet, and it's going to be touching directly on the pulley. Then we can do each bearing flange side out, same as the other side. And then we can add a screw into the end of each end. The screws aren't necessary right now, but it does just make it a little bit easier so nothing falls apart as you're doing this next step. And they don't need to be snugged up or anything, they just need to be there to hold it. So the next step, what you'll do is you'll actually pull the shafts back until the belt is tight and the bearings snap into either side of the drive rail. And you can just work your way down the drive rail, going away from the input. All right, so now we have all these in. You can see that you would add your wheels here, and that's actually what the 3 extra spacers are for. So they add the space between the bearing race and the wheel assembly that you decide to use. That's it. This is the drive rail 3 done. So this is a drive rail 3 because it's got 3 output wheels, 24 inches long, and it's made for 4-inch wheels. There are plenty of models available if you look on our website. And then this assembly also works for the drive rail 4 model. You just have to add another wheel, either with the other link belt on this end or the other link belt on this end. And obviously there's also one more location to add your gearbox. With this assembly here, you can also you can have your wheels on the outside of the robot, or the gearbox on the inside of the robot and the wheels on the outside like this. Or in the configuration I had it earlier, you can have your wheels on the outside of the robot and your gearbox on the outside of the robot as well, with these hanging over. This can also be mounted 180, and you can have the motors, in this instance it would be hanging outside the frame perimeter. You don't want that. So if we do this, and this was 180, your motors would be hanging into the robot, more like a traditional style gearbox. If you have any questions about these products, you can email us in the link that will be down in the link below, or you can check out our website at plumberindustries.com. Thank you.